Thank you so much, and thanks for having us. I should mention that this is the first time we present this material, and so I'm very happy to be doing it at the Linguistic Justice Society. There could be a better audience, and I'll just dive straight into it. Let's see. Okay, so just a little outline of what we're going to talk about today. First of all, I'm going to do a little introduction and talk about what we mean when we talk about linguistic inequity in philosophy, what we know about it, so what previous studies have shown, and why should we care about. So then I'll head over to Paul, who's gonna present our study, tell you a little bit about how we collected data, how we analyzed it, what we found, and spoiler alert, we found like a difference in like how the sort of proportion, how represented non-native authors as opposed to native authors are in both overall journals like in general and top journals in particular. So then Lucien is going to discuss this result and talk a little bit about the potential explanation for this gap and the limitations of our studies and what future studies could do. So I'll start talking about linguistic inequity a bit, and probably some of you who are regular to these seminars will have heard many of these things, but it's good to have a general overview of the background for the study. So the idea here obviously is that we're interested in academic philosophy, but clearly we're dealing with a much broader phenomena that arises across academia, but also like in society in general. Why is philosophy interesting? Well, analytic philosophy arguably faces distinctive difficulties of linguistic justice, for instance, because language tends to be so important in the presentations of the results of one research as opposed to some other disciplines, for instance, scientific disciplines. And perhaps it also faces more severe difficulties in some way or another. And this, as some authors have noted, is partially due to historical causes. So clearly, analytic philosophy in particular has developed within English-speaking institutions, university, traditionally was published in the beginning at least, predominantly in journals based at Anglophone university, and so on and so forth. So it's no surprise that there is a little bit of disparity in terms of how like epistemic resources and possibility to publish and to proceed in a career in analytic philosophy are distributed across different countries and countries that speak different languages. But clearly, this doesn't explain alone our current situation, since many years have passed since there seems to be still quite a significant gap. And when I'm talking about the gap, of course, when I'm talking about linguistic inequity, I am somewhat presupposing that non-native speakers face some sort of difficulties. And this would be just speculation, but luckily we already have a lot of studies that indicate how big is this gap and what the nature of the linguistic discrimination that people face might be. So here I'm just going to resume a little bit what previous studies have found, so that you have an idea of the literature before we proceed to present our study. So first of all, there have been works investigating the difference between Anglophone philosophers and non-Anglophone philosophers. On the one hand, in terms of citation, so a study by Schwitzgebel and colleagues found that in prestigious journal, only about 3% of the references were originally written in a language other than English, and this difference is even broader when we move to newer references, which basically means that with the exception of a few classics of philosophy, like Kant or Plato, there are very few works that get cited that are not originally written in English. Similar results were found with an analysis of the 100 most cited philosophers in the prominent encyclopedia, Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, where it was found that only 13 were born in non-Anglophone countries. And when we factor in that many of these authors moved into Anglophone countries to work at Anglophone institution. We have that only 6 managed to make it to the top without doing so. And of these 6, only 1, namely Habermas, worked all his life outside the Anglo-Saxon world. So this indicates that basically, unless you get involved with Anglophone institution heavily, it's very unlikely that you will make it to the very top in terms of influence within analytic philosophy. Similar patterns for editorial boards. Only 4% of scholars that are part of the most prominent, the editorial board of the most prominent journals isn't based at an Anglophone institution, meaning once again that unless you work at an Anglophone institution, it's extremely unlikely that you will be part of an editorial board of a prominent journal. So these were more about Anglophone versus not Anglophone, but now moving on to English-speaking, native speakers versus non-native speakers. We have that the publication rates and the visibility of non-native scholars is much different. In an analysis of Kieran Healy's corpus, Gabriele Contesta found that about 6% of the 500 most cited work of this corpus were authored by non-native philosophers, meaning only a small part of the very most influential publication. And another study found that only about 30% of the article published in high-tier philosophy journals, so not just the very, very top, but still like the most influential journals, is authored by non-native scholars. And when you factor in that some of these scholars have moved into the Anglophone work to work at Anglophone institution, we have that this gap becomes even broader when we exclude people who have made this move. So it's very unlikely, again, well, it's more unlikely that you get published in this journal, it seems, if you don't belong to an Anglophone institution and if you're non-native. So there are obviously many ways to explain these differences. It's not that in itself they tell us that people are actively discriminating against non-native speakers, but surely it tells us that in some way or another, analytic philosophy has a linguistic problem, meaning that native and non-native speakers experience radically different opportunities to publish, sit in editorial boards, and be cited. So I just now briefly want to mention a few reasons why we should care about it, and then we'll move on to present the study. So why should we care about linguistic discrimination, linguistic inequity, and so forth? Well, first of all, it seems that it's part of a broader form of injustice. So we know that people are discriminated sometimes based on their accent, appearance, style of expression, etc. And it seems that what we have here is a version of this phenomenon within academia. So insofar as we think that the broader phenomenon is unjust and needs addressing, it seems that this one needs addressing as well, right? So the idea here is that it's bad in itself, but it's not just bad in itself, it also has practical consequences that we might regard as undesirable. First of all, in terms of a distribution of resources within the discipline. So the idea here is that based on whether you're native or non-native, you might have different opportunities, different chances of achieving academic prestige, even different ability to move between institutions and live, a fulfilling life while being in academic. So just to spell out this idea a little bit, we live in a world which is undeniable. It's increasingly jobs are distributed based on metrics such as where you publish, how much you publish, the impact factor of the journals you publish, or how influential your work is, whether or not you have achieved some markers of prestige, such as sitting on an editorial board, and so on and so forth. So if it is true that non-native speakers have a harder time achieving this sort of a career milestones, then it is also true that non-native speakers face limited access to important resources, to opportunities in terms of progressing in the career, of moving from one institution to another, etc. So here is more like a practical consequences of the broader linguistic injustice. Another issue that obviously arises and is relevant is epistemic injustice. So in specifically testimonial injustice, we have that presumably non-native speakers suffer a credibility deficit, as we call it in the relevant literature. So the idea here is that non-native speakers are trusted less than the trust that is due to them, so to say. And this presumably is due to an identity prejudice, which fits the standard definition of testimonial injustice. And it would seem that the data that we found supports this picture insofar that it seems that non-native philosophers have smaller chances to acquire what I called earlier these markets of expertise, so publication in top journals, members in editorial boards, etc. That makes it the case that they are heard less than their native counterparts, they're listened to less, they're believed less, and so forth. In some cases, we might even think that what's going on here is a more specific phenomenon that's been called testimonial quieting or preemptive testimonial injustice, which is a phenomenon whereby basically one's contribution is preemptively dismissed just because it comes from a person with a certain identity. So the idea here is that non-native speakers can suffer form of injustice where people just don't bother to read their work because they come from a certain background, from a certain country, or maybe they don't receive as many invitations, chances to publish, shortlisted for jobs, etc. So this would fall under the remit of the sort of label of testimonial quality. So I've mentioned some injustices, but you might think that you don't care about injustice at all. I doubt, given the audience I'm speaking to, but it's worth mentioning that there are also broader reasons to worry about this sort of discrimination. So the idea here would be the following: we might just care about scientific progress and how efficient, analytic philosophy is as a sort of epistemic system that is meant to deliver some epistemic good, for instance, discover truth about a certain philosophical domain or advance our knowledge of a given philosophical topic. And we might simply be interested in evaluating how efficient this system is in delivering these epistemic goods that it purposed to aim to. So this is the approach that system-oriented social epistemology tends to take, whereby we evaluate an epistemic network based on its ability to achieve some goal. And presumably, in terms of how the different nodes in the network interact with each other, we want to have a network where trust between nodes is calibrated to each node's competence, reliability, and accuracy. What do I mean by this? Basically, I mean that every scholar should presumably trust each other based on competence. So how broad someone's knowledge is, reliability. By reliability, I have in mind something like, if you claim something, how likely is it that it will be true? And accuracy, more like an actual, did you actually got things right? So reliability here is more counterfactual, accuracy is more actual. Anyway, we could think of metrics like this, but the idea is that we have trust that is calibrated to this sort of indicator broadly, if an epistemic network is to be efficient. Now, by definition, if we have testimonial injustice, people are using different criteria to calibrate their trust, because precisely by definition, testimonial injustice is a phenomenon whereby we assign trust also based on some bias or some form, or one form of another. So the consequence that we have here is that by definition, a system where we have testimonial injustice is a suboptimal system in terms of delivering some epistemic goods. We might disagree about what it is. Could it be knowledge of philosophical topic, discovering truths, whatever. Presumably, in every case, we will have a suboptimal sort of version of the network if we have testimonial injustice. So just to wrap up, the idea here is that even if you're a purely immoral evaluator who doesn't care about justice at all, only about scientific progress, there are excellent reasons to think that linguistic injustice needs addressing nonetheless, because it stands in the way of truth, so to say. So having said all this, why do we need some studies on analytic philosophy? Well, obviously, the idea here is that if we want to address some injustice, some gap between native and non-native speaker, we first need to get a sense of what this gap is, whether it actually exists, what's its nature, what kind of forms, right, it takes, and also whether existing measures that we have tried in the past have had any effect, so that we can better adjust our reactions to this phenomenon to try to advance, let's say, or address this problem. So here the idea is that we want to address a problem competently, and in order to do so, we need to investigate the phenomenon of linguistic inequity in academic philosophy. So the next question obviously is, hasn't this been done already? Haven't you shown us that there are already quite a few studies that have investigated the phenomenon? Well, that is true, but on the other hand, all of these studies had to work with quite a limited sample size. So a few of those studies were working just with the last issue of a journal. Some of them had a broader purpose, but for a selection of prestigious journals, or perhaps in some cases working just within a decade or a couple of decades. So here we took instead a big data approach that really allows us to look at trends across time. So we have a much broader time span and a much broader selection of journals, which allows us to get a much more complete picture and to look at trends in time. Another reason why we think our approach constitutes an improvement over these previous studies is that previous studies only reported raw proportions. So they told us, for instance, that, say, only 6% of the authors who published in the top 500 most cited papers were non-native speakers, but they didn't tell us how big a portion of how this compares to the portion of the population. So it might just be that only 6% of people who write in philosophy are non-native speakers, in which case they would be perfectly represented. So instead, we focused on representativeness, which we think is an improvement of a previous study. So now I'll head over to Paul, who's going to present on the actual study.
Yeah, but you'll have to click through the slides for me. So next slide, please. And then the one after that. Yeah, thank you. So as Neri already mentioned, one of the major limitations of previous studies is their, by comparison, fairly limited sample size. So we strove to go for a nice big data set. For that, we used a few different data sources. The sort of two main data sources for our for the metadata were Web of Science and Phil Papers, and I'll say a little bit more about how we got the data from there. But we got around 100,000 philosophy articles from there. These were published in 223 journals, and they cover about the last 50 years. So that's what we're working with. And then obviously the main outcome of interest this study was interested in was native language. Unfortunately, there's no good way that we know of to automatically code articles for the native language of their authors, right? So unless you want to go in there and look at CVs or information on social media individually, that's not going to work. It's definitely not going to work for 100,000 articles unless you have an army of student assistants, which we did not. So instead, what we did is we looked for proxy measures, so measures that can hopefully approximate the outcome we're actually interested in. And the first one we chose here are authors' institutional addresses. And the idea there is just if an author works in a non-majority English-speaking country, then they are more likely than not, hopefully, to be non-native themselves and vice versa. And then the second proxy measure was the location of the PhD granting institution. So there the reasoning is if somebody got their PhD at an institution in a non-majority English-speaking country, then again, more likely than not, hopefully, they will be non-native themselves, and again, vice versa. And we'll have to say a little bit more about how well this reasoning works in the end. Just a quick note, so by majority native English-speaking countries, we're just referring to a definition by the UK government, which they seem to be authoritative enough on which countries are majority English-speaking to our taste. All right, next slide, please. So a little bit more about the data collection. As I already mentioned, Phil Papers and Web of Science were the two main sources for the metadata. Phil Papers, probably everyone is familiar, but it's just a big database sort of maintained by philosophers for philosophers of published articles, published books in philosophy. And Web of Science is pretty much the same, but broader. So it's across pretty much all areas of science and the humanities. So what we did is we basically downloaded from these two databases everything they had on philosophy. So in the case of Phil Papers, that's everything, and in the case of Web of Science, they have various categories for philosophy that we scraped all entries for, and then we matched them together. Limited that data to only articles, because there's also reviews, editorials, front matter, calls for abstracts, that kind of stuff also gets published, but we weren't interested in that, just original research articles. Limited it to English language articles, because that is, I think, self-explanatory. And then also I briefly mentioned to these two Web of Science categories, philosophy and philosophy of science, which are the most the two that are most clearly philosophy, which then left us with, I'll say it again, 223 journals, around 100,000 articles covering about the last 50 years. And this is to our first proxy measure. Over 90% of those had at least one institutional address listed. And these are the institutional addresses that are given on the paper. So this is where the author was at the time the paper was published, or around the time the paper was published. And then another source of data we used was Phil People, and this is for our second proxy measure. So Phil People is sort of the social/professional networking arm of Phil Papers, where people can have profiles and tell people, about upcoming conferences and the papers they published and all that kind of stuff. And we scraped all of the individual profiles we found on there, so it's around 60,000, a bit more, and then matched these Phil People profiles to the entries, the journal articles in our data set, where that was possible. And that was only possible for 40% of articles. That's especially because the further back you go in time, and remember our data set starts in 1975, that gets a lot harder. It gets a lot better the closer to the present you come. And then of those matched Phil People profiles, around 50% of those had the PhD granting institution listed of the author with a country that we could then code. Thank you. So to start with, here's the current distribution in terms of the raw proportions of non-English or non-native English-speaking and native English-speaking authors, measured by these two proxy measures that you can see on the x-axis that we found. So when you focus on institutional addresses, which is my left, and your left as well, because I'm not standing in front of the screen, then you can see that the raw proportion of native English-speaking authors is a bit higher than that of non-native English-speaking authors across all these 220-ish journals. And if you focus on the PhD granting institution, the disparity becomes a lot bigger. So there, the proportion of the native English-speaking folks is much higher than the not native English-speaking folks. But as Neri already mentioned, we think that just looking at these proportions isn't really all that informative. And the reason I think you already explained well. The idea is just that depending on what the overall proportion of working non-native English-speaking philosophers is, these proportions might either be problematic or not. So they might either indicate underrepresentation or overrepresentation or perfect representation. It just depends on the underlying sort of base proportions of overall non-native English-speaking working philosophers. And so in order to take that into account, what we needed was some sort of estimate of that overall proportion. And what we used there again is the other Phil people profiles. So we basically just counted up all of the profiles that had an address listed in a non-majority English-speaking country, and all the ones that had an address listed in a majority English-speaking countries, and then used those as our estimates for these base proportions. And then using that, we defined this nice representativeness index, which is just in sort of a mathematical formula what I just said. So it's the proportion of non-English-speaking, native English-speaking authors divided by their overall proportion among working philosophers. So just two little sort of illustrative examples on how to interpret that. So an R of 0.5 would mean that the proportion of non-native English-speaking authors we find is sort of half what we would expect given their overall proportion among working philosophers. And vice versa, an R of 2 would be that they're sort of overrepresented by a factor of 2. So it's twice what we would expect to find given their overall proportion among all working philosopher. Thank you. So here's the figure you just saw, but this time in the overlays are these estimates of the base proportions what we have. And so what you can see there is if we look at the institutional addresses on the left side, and we look at the brownish bar, then you can see that there is some moderate amount of underrepresentation for non-native English-speaking authors, again, across all of these journals. So an R of 0.89. And when you focus on the right-hand side, where we looked at the PhD granting institutions instead, the level of underrepresentation becomes much more severe. So there it's around 0.5. Okay, so far this has been information about all of these 223 journals combined, but as Neri also already mentioned in the introduction, not all philosophy journals are created equal. Philosophers love their prestige, or at least that's my impression. And so some philosophy journals are much more important in the minds of the philosophical community, carry a lot more name recognition, prestige, importance for hiring decisions, and promotion decisions and all that kind of nice stuff that everybody wants. So we thought it would be a good idea to see if these results are, if there's anything that changes about these results when we just zoom in on the top journals and compare that to sort of everything else. And there's many different ways you might want to quantify prestige. We use two. One is there's a number of these industry polls out there. I guess sort of among the most well-known ones are these reports, polls on Leiter reports, which is this well-read philosophy blog where he sometimes asks his readers to rank philosophy journals according to their prestige. Other people have used that in metaphilosophical work. We used two of these polls, put them together. This resulted in 34 top journals, and just from, I can give them to you, but from looking at them, all of these are journals basically. And then we also use citation metrics. So the idea is as you sort of use the basically some metric based on the number of citation a journal gets over a certain period of time to quantify how impactful it is. Here we use the journal citation indicator, which is what Web of Science uses and then again just ranked journals by their JCI and took the top 13% to have the same number of journals as we had from the industry polls. And then the question was, how does the level of representation of non-native English-speaking authors compare between these two groups, the top journals and the non-top journals? Which is what you can see here. So this now no longer is proportions, but this now is the representative index R. The top panel shows the top journals as defined by their journal citation index. On the bottom, you can see the polling. In blue, you see the journal average for the top journals, and in red for the non-top journals. And on the bottom, you can again see our two different proxy measures. So it's a bit complex, a lot of complexity going on there, but I think it's I hope it's sort of all right. And what you can see for all of these is basically that there's this gap between the top journals and the non-top journals. More specifically, the average R is lower for the top journals than the non-top journals, meaning that underrepresentation of non-native authors is more severe in the top journals than in the non-top journals. How much more severe is it? So if you look at institution addresses and sort of average across these two ways of understanding top journals, what you find is in the non-top journals, the non-native authors are basically represented, more or less, whereas in the top journals, their proportion is almost only half of what you would expect given their base proportion. And then from the PhD granting institutions, similarly, the gap is sort of similar. So it's a factor of 1 there. So in the non-top journals, their proportion is about half what you would expect, and in the top journals, it's a third of what you would expect. So again, similar size of gap, just shifted lower towards 0. All right, next slides. Thank you. Well, this was sort of just for now. So the now we define as the last 5 years, which I guess some people will probably have, some metaphysicians probably wouldn't like, but that's what we did. But one nice advantage of our data is that it's longitudinal, right? So we have time series data, and so we could also look at this over time, which is what we did here. We chose to only focus on the industry polling definition of top journals because journal citation indicators only get reported for a few years into the past. But these polling results many of these journals seem to have been top journals for a long time, so that seemed to make sense for us. And then again, you can see here in red this is the non-top journals, and blue is the top journals. What you can see is, so overall, the representation of non-native authors has increased, but also the gap between the non-top journals and the top journals has widened over time. And this is confirmed, but we did some linear mixed effects models analysis, and that is also clear to see there. And that's sort of a striking finding, we thought, and one that perhaps cries out for some sort of explanation, which we couldn't come up with on the spot, but we thought people would be interested to see that and maybe have ideas of their own. All right. Oh yeah, and then so this is sort of the descriptive stuff we have, and then Lucien is going to move on to some potential explanation for this gap we found between the two journal groups, because that is sort of an interesting factoid we found there.
Thank you very much, Paul. So now we'll look at these possible explanations for the gap between top and non-top journals. And of course, there are like a myriad of possible explanations, but we have discussed 5 different explanations among our little team. 2 of those explanations are rather difficult to investigate, and 3 other explanations will go more into detail a little bit later. So among the 2 explanations that are more difficult to investigate, the first one concerns the overall quality of the papers. So according to this explanation, it might be possible that non-native speakers produce lower quality manuscript overall than native speakers. This would include arguments, the structure of the paper, presentation of the content, storytelling, and so on. And the problem with investigating such an explanation is just that manuscript quality is very hard to assess on the scale of our project, but also more generally because it's quite subjective whether a manuscript is good or not. And the second explanation is self-selection. So here the idea is that non-native speakers submit less often to top-ranking journals than native speakers. And this could have like several reasons. For example, it might be that they feel that their work is just not good enough or something like this. And the issue with investigating this kind of explanation is that we would have to look at paper submissions and not just at published papers. And we are just only looking at published papers. And as far as we know, there's almost no systematically collected data about paper submissions on the level of analysis that we would require for our study. But apart from these two explanations, we went into more detail studying three other explanations, namely active discrimination on the side of the journals, then differences in language quality between native speakers and non-native speakers, and differences in the areas of interest. So then we can go to the next slide. So yeah, let's first look at active discrimination as a possible explanation for the low representation of non-native speakers in top journals. So to back, yeah, thank you. So to investigate this, we looked at the impact of changing the peer review models in a subset of the top journals concerning the level of representation of non-native speakers. So we specifically look at the impact of the change from non-blind to double-blind review and from non-blind and double-blind to triple-blind. For this, we use so-called interrupted time series or ITS. This is a quasi-experimental design to evaluate the impact of an intervention on longitudinal data. So in our case, the intervention is just the change in the peer review model, for example, from non-blind to double-blind. And yeah, so this design just allows us to measure changes in the trajectory of a time series after peer review policy changes. Just as a little caveat, it's just important to note that we only currently have data on past and present peer review policies of a subset of top journals and not of non-top journals. We therefore cannot compare the impact of these policy changes across top and non-top journals. Then we can move on to the good stuff. So here we just look at the impact of changes in peer review policies based on our two proxies, so institutional addresses and PhD granting institution. And what we find is that institutional addresses show us some kind of effect of policy change in the peer review model, whereas PhD granting institutions do not. So on the right-hand side, you see the ITS for institutional addresses. The plot on the top shows the impact of the policy change from non-blind to double-blind reviews, and the plot on the bottom shows the change from non-blind and double-blind to triple-blind. The x-axis simply represents the years up to or since the policy change. So the time point 0, which is this red line that you see, marks the introduction of the respective peer review model. So in the top plot, this would be the double-blind review. The years prior to the change are negative, so to the left of 0, and the ones after it are positive, which are on the right side of 0. And the y-axis gives you the R metric that Paul introduced before, so the representativeness of non-native speakers in a journal. The different colors that you see here code for different journals, but you can ignore this for now and just focus on the black line in the plot, which is just like the average of all these lines. And as we can see, the average representativeness is lower before the respective policy changes and makes a substantial jump after the new peer review model gets implemented. And we think that this is just like immediate evidence for the impact of change in the peer review models on the representation of non-native speakers in top journals. And we find this for institutional addresses, but we don't find this for PhD granting institutions. So it's kind of a mixed bag of results, but at least we find that like changes in the peer review model helps non-native speakers to get more visibility. Then we can go to the next one. So the next explanation we looked at is language quality. The idea here is that manuscripts by non-native speakers are on average worse in terms of language quality than manuscripts written by native speakers. So accordingly, top journals would then just select for language quality to a greater extent than non-top journals. This would explain the gap between top and non-top journals. Well, the problem with investigating this hypothesis is that it is very hard to actually measure language quality in academic texts. So we tried to estimate language quality using large language models like ChatGPT, just asked it like, what is the quality of this text on a scale of 1 to 10 regarding language. But the problem is just that overall, the level of English is so high among academic texts that we found hardly any variance in this annotation. So instead, we again use a proxy measure for language quality. We namely look at the linguistic distance of a country's official language to English. So linguistic distance is just like a fancy term for how hard it is for someone who, for example, speaks Chinese to learn English compared to someone who speaks German, for example. And the idea behind this proxy is that higher linguistic distance to English correlates with lower mastery in English. This is kind of the general idea. And we can go to the next slide. So for this analysis, we used the linguistic distance metrics provided in a paper by Chiswick and Miller. Their metric ranges from 1 to 3, where a score of 1 indicates a very high linguistic distance to English, and a score of 3 indicates a very close proximity to English. So Chinese and Japanese, for example, both have a score of 1, so they're very distant to English. It's harder to learn English if you're part of a Chinese-speaking community, whereas German, for example, has a score of 3. So for German-speaking people, it's easier to learn English. In the plot on the right, you see the average linguistic distance to English for non-top journals in red and for top journals in green. And as we can see, the average for top journals is significantly higher than the one for non-top journals. And this simply means that authors in top journals have a smaller distance to English than non-top journals on average. And here we really just look at non-native speaker and not native speakers. No, we can stay on the last slide. But one problem with this is that if we look at the actual differences between the averages here, we see that they're actually super tiny. So if you look at the y-axis, the differences between non-top and top journals is 0.05, which is almost comically small, right? So overall, this is very inconclusive evidence, and we can almost say nothing based on these results. Then next up, we look at another possible explanation, namely that non-native speakers tend to be more interested in and therefore spend more time working on areas of philosophy that tend to be published less frequently in top journals. And for this, we look at 5 major subfield clusters that have been listed on field papers, which include language, epistemology, metaphysics, and mind, the history of Western philosophy, science, logic and mathematics, value theory, and philosophical tradition. And what we did then is we just, for each subfield cluster, then calculated the proportions of native and non-native speakers, which you then see on the next slide. Exactly, yeah. So here again, you have our two proxy measures on the left, the institutional addresses, on the right, the PhD granting institutions. And what we see here is that the proportion of native speakers is generally larger than that of the non-native speakers, which we already saw before. But what we find is that there are also differences in the areas of interest. So for example, if we look at philosophical traditions, so in the middle, so the middle bar, we see that the difference is the smallest between non-English speaking authors and English speaking authors. And for value theory, it's the most pronounced. So we actually find differences. Now, if we go to the next slide, so it seems that we find differences, but the question is whether these differences actually have implications on representativeness or not. To investigate this, we compared 3 linear mixed effects models to actually test whether the interaction between journal group and subfield cluster actually leads to a better fit or not. For this, we compared 3 models, so a base model M0, where the metric R is the outcome variable, and the journal group, so top versus non-top journals, is the only predictor. Then we add a second model, M1, with where we just add subfield cluster as an additional predictor. And in model M2, we also include the interaction between journal group and subfield cluster. And for both of our proxies, so institutional addresses and PhD granting institutions, we find that M1 provides a significantly better fit than M0, but M2 did not provide a significantly better fit than M1. So in other words, this means that there is kind of no evidence that differences in the areas of interest explain the gap in representativeness between top and non-top journals. So again, the explanation doesn't really lead to anything. Now I will just quickly summarize our findings. So first of all, we find that non-English speaking authors or non-native English speaking authors are underrepresented in philosophy journals across the board, and that there is a more severe underrepresentation in philosophy's top journal compared to the non-top journal. That's the gap we were talking about for the last hour. Overall, there's also positive news. So it seems that representation has improved since 1975 over time. But the negative news is that the gap between top and non-top journals has widened at the same time. Another probably positive news is that blind reviews has some effect in narrowing the gap and thus helps for the visibility for non-native English speaking authors. Overall, our findings are compatible with the picture that we outlined at the beginning, or that Neri outlined at the beginning, namely that work by non-English native English speaking authors is less likely to be published and often less visible than that of native English speaking authors. So it's just published in lower tier journals. And this likely also translates into different forms of injustice, namely epistemic or social injustice. And again, we found no clear explanations for the gap between top and non-top journals. Lastly, I will quickly run through some limitations of our study. We formulated these limitations as in the form of questions. So the first question that comes to mind is, of course, how accurate our proxy measure actually is for the distinction between native and non-native speakers. Again, we used as a proxy either institutional affiliation or the PhD granting institution. And we actually have 2 ideas of testing the accuracy of our proxy measure and also to maybe improve or come up with a different proxy measure. So the first idea that we have is that we intend on testing the accuracy of our proxy by comparing it with the data gathered in a paper by Yen and Hung. So Yen and Hung looked at CVs of authors to determine whether they are native speakers or not. And we intend to use their subsample as kind of a sanity check of the proxy measures that we have already. And another idea that we had is to train a classifier based on a small subsample of correctly annotated data, for example, the data by Yen and Hung, and then just generalize it over the rest of our whole data. But we would generally be very interested just to hear your ideas about maybe other proxies or how we could improve our existing proxies later on in a discussion. Another potential worry we have concerns our estimate of the proportion of the working non-native English-speaking philosophers overall. So it seems that the platform Phil People almost certainly has a bias towards the English-speaking world, especially the US, as a higher proportion of native speakers have a profile on Phil papers than non-native speakers. Hence, it's very likely that we are overestimating the level of representation of non-native English-speaking authors. And lastly, we have a last limitation that concerns the fact that it is very difficult actually to investigate many of the potential explanations for the gap between top and non-top journals. For example, it's very hard, as I already told you before, to assess the overall quality, for example, of a publication, as this is very subjective. When it comes, for example, to the explanation of self-selection, it's very hard to get data about paper submissions to journals or about like the overall thought processes that goes into submission decisions for authors where they send their paper to. And the publication data that we have at hand alone cannot really tell us anything about whether self-selection plays a role here or not. And yeah, when it comes to active discrimination, we would probably require observational data to make really strong causal claims. So what we found here is more like statistical acrobatics that we do to get to like a causal claim, but it would be much a stronger claim if we actually had observational data. But despite these limitations, we hope that we could provide you with some like interesting insights into linguistic inequity in academic philosophy. And yeah, we are looking forward to the discussion. Thank you very much for your attention.